Lady Eve Meryton stood alone before the tall windows of Thornfield Manor, her reflection pale against the dark glass as rain pressed softly from the night outside. The gold wedding band on her finger felt heavier than any chain. Only hours had passed since she became the wife of the most feared man in England, yet it already felt like a lifetime. The whispers still rang in her ears, sharp and cruel, following her like shadows down the aisle. They had called her a sacrifice, a girl sold to save a ruined family. She remembered the chapel too clearly, the way the room had gone quiet when the Duke of Thornwall entered. Lord Cassian Vale had stood tall and unmoving, dressed in black, his face carved from stone. A thin scar at his temple caught the light, making him seem dangerous and distant all at once. People said his first wife had died in his house under strange circumstances. People said he was cold, cruel, and merciless. Eve had tried not to listen, but fear had settled deep in her chest. She reached for the oval locket at her throat, her mother's last gift. Her family's fate rested on that marriage. Her father's debts had grown too heavy to bear. Properties were lost, creditors waited, and prison loomed close. When the Duke's proposal arrived through his solicitor, it felt less like an offer and more like a sentence. Her father had begged her not to do it, but his shaking hands told the truth. Eve had agreed without tears. Duty was all she had left. Thunder cracked in the distance as the bedchamber doors opened. Lord Cassian Vale stepped inside, framed by soft light from the hall. He had removed his coat, but remained formal, as if this meeting were business instead of a wedding night. The room was warm and carefully prepared, fresh sheets, burning fire, and the faint scent of lavender. It felt wrong for a marriage born from fear and need. "My lord," Eve said quietly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "Lady Eve," he replied, his tone deep and controlled. "I trust the room meets your comfort." "It is more than generous, your grace." Silence filled the space between them. Eve knew what was expected of her. She had prepared herself for coldness, for pain, maybe even cruelty. Her heart raced as he stepped closer. She lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tight. "Look at me," he said softly. She obeyed, lifting her gaze. What she saw surprised her. His eyes were not cruel. They were guarded, thoughtful, almost burdened. "You tremble," he said. "I will compose myself," she replied quickly. "You fear me." It was not a question, Eve swallowed. "I know my duty." He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and gentle, nothing like she had imagined. He did not pull her closer. He simply held her hand, his thumb brushing her skin with care. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Tonight, you will rest." Eve stared at him, unable to speak. The words she had practiced vanished. He released her hand and stepped back. "Sleep well, Lady Thornwall." When he left, she stood frozen, her heart beating in a way she did not understand. 3 weeks passed at Blackmir Hall, the Duke's ancient estate rising from the mist like a fortress. Eve learned its long corridors and quiet rooms, though she still felt like a guest in her own life. Cassian remained distant but polite. They dined together, spoke with courtesy, and retired to separate rooms. Each night he escorted her to her door, bowed, and left. Yet she could not forget the warmth of his touch from that first night. One morning the housekeeper announced a visitor. Mrs. Agatha Pelmore, Eve's former governess and dearest friend. Joy flooded her chest as she hurried to greet the woman who had raised her after her mother's death. Agatha embraced her warmly, studying her with knowing eyes. "You look well," Agatha said. "Better than I feared." "The marriage is not what I expected," Eve admitted. Before Agatha could ask more, Cassian entered the room. He greeted Agatha with respect and surprised Eve by inviting her to stay as long as she wished. When he left, Agatha raised an eyebrow. "He is not the monster they describe," she said. "I do not think so," Eve replied, though doubt still lingered. Agatha brought troubling news from London. Lady Verena Hawthorne claimed to have been close to the Duke and hinted at dark truths about his past. Fear tightened Eve's chest. The question she tried to ignore returned stronger than before. Later that day, Eve sought peace in the library. Surrounded by old books and silence, she found comfort until Cassian entered. They spoke of books, of her education, of her mother. For the first time, his guard lowered. He gave her a book that once belonged to his mother, a simple gift that felt deeply personal. Their moment was broken when Sir Darius Crowe entered. Eve sensed tension and slipped away, but not before hearing part of their conversation. There were hints of threats, of Lady Verena, of secrets not yet revealed. Fear crept back into her heart. Days later, Cassian summoned her urgently. He held a letter filled with threats and lies, accusing him of scandal and warning that Eve's honor was at risk. Cassian's anger was controlled but fierce. "I will not allow you to be dishonored," he said firmly. When she pressed him for truth, he finally spoke of his first wife. She had been gentle and fragile, broken by lies spread by Lady Verena. Cassian blamed himself for failing to protect her. "I will not fail you," he said. Eve understood then. His distance was not cruelty but caution. His restraint was not rejection but respect. She reached for his hand, placing it over her heart. "We will face this together," she said. For the first time, Cassian did not pull away. The days after Cassian's confession felt different to Eve, as if the air inside Blackmir Hall had shifted. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear, but filled with unspoken understanding. They did not rush toward closeness, yet something steady and real had begun to grow. Cassian still kept a careful distance, but now his eyes followed her with concern rather than caution, and his words carried quiet respect. The blackmail letter remained a dark cloud over them. Cassian worked late into the nights, meeting with trusted men and sending discreet messages beyond the estate. Eve sensed the tension in his posture, the way his jaw tightened whenever Sir Darius's name was mentioned. Though fear lingered, she refused to shrink from it. She had married a feared duke, but she would not live as a frightened wife. When Cassian finally told her his plan, she listened closely. The blackmailer had demanded a response to be left during a grand ball in London. Cassian believed the threat came from more than one hand, and that the only way to end it was to draw them into the open. "We will go together," he said firmly. "They expect weakness. We will show them unity." Eve felt fear rise, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Then we go together," she replied. The night of the ball arrived with blinding light and cruel curiosity. The ballroom glittered with crystal and gold, filled with the very people who once whispered about her fate. As Eve entered on Cassian's arm, the room fell silent. Every eye turned toward them. She felt their judgment like 1,000 needles, but Cassian's steady presence anchored her. Whispers followed them across the floor. Some spoke of pity, others of doom. Eve lifted her chin and walked on. This was not the frightened girl who stood trembling on her wedding night. Lady Verena Hawthorne appeared before them in crimson silk, her beauty sharp and dangerous. Her smile was thin, her eyes calculating. "So the rumors were wrong," Verena said lightly. "You are still alive, Duchess." Eve smiled back, calm and unshaken. "Disappointment does not suit you, Lady Verena." Cassian's voice cut in, cold and steady. "You have made a mistake, Verena. This ends tonight." The exchange drew attention. Guests leaned closer, hungry for scandal. Sir Darius soon joined them, his face pale beneath false confidence. Before he could speak, Cassian raised his voice just enough for those nearby to hear. "Anonymous letters and false threats are the tools of cowards," Cassian said. "I prefer honesty." The room quieted. Eve felt her heart race but stood firm at his side. Before anyone could interrupt, Eve stepped forward. Her voice was clear and strong. "The letters you threaten us with are lies, and we have proof." Shock rippled through the crowd. Lady Verena's smile faltered. Sir Darius stiffened. Cassian signaled a footman, who stepped forward holding sealed documents. "Testimony," Cassian said simply. "From those you trusted." Lady Verena's composure shattered. She laughed sharply, but fear flickered behind her eyes. "This is madness," she snapped. "You cannot ruin us without ruining yourselves." Eve turned to face the watching crowd. "You already tried to ruin us with lies," she said. "Tonight, we choose truth." She reached for her locket and opened it, revealing a folded note hidden inside. "This," she continued, "is written in Lady Verena's hand. Instructions for the very threats sent to our home." A stunned silence followed. Sir Darius stammered, but Cassian silenced him with a single look. "You are finished," Cassian said quietly. Lady Verena fled the room in humiliation. Sir Darius followed soon after, his future destroyed by his own greed. The guests murmured in disbelief as the truth settled among them. Then Cassian turned to Eve and held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. She placed her hand in his without hesitation. As they moved onto the floor, the orchestra slowly resumed. The dance was gentle, unhurried. Cassian's hand rested at her waist with care, guiding rather than claiming. Eve felt warmth spread through her, not fear, not duty, but trust. For the first time, the Tun did not see a monster and his sacrifice. They saw a duke standing beside his wife, and a woman unafraid to stand beside him. When the music ended, the room filled with quiet applause. Cassian leaned close and spoke softly. "You were fearless." "So were you," she replied. The ride back to Blackmir Hall was silent but peaceful. When they reached the manor, Cassian paused at her door as he always had, then stopped himself. "You need not be alone tonight," he said carefully, "only if you wish." Eve searched his face and saw no demand, only patience. "I wish," she said. Inside, the fire burned low. Cassian moved slowly, giving her space. When he finally touched her, it was with the same gentleness that had left her speechless on their wedding night, but now she understood it. This was not fear. This was choice. And for the first time, Eve knew her marriage was no longer a bargain. It was becoming something real. Spring arrived at Blackmir Hall quietly, as if the estate itself had been holding its breath through winter, and had finally decided it was safe to exhale. Pale green leaves pushed through bare branches, and the gardens, once cold and severe, softened with new life. Eve often stood by the windows in the morning, watching the grounds awaken, feeling as though the change outside mirrored the one within her own heart. Much had changed since the night of the ball. London society moved on quickly, as it always did. New scandals replaced old ones. Lady Verena Hawthorne vanished from fashionable circles, her beauty no longer enough to save her reputation. Sir Darius Crowe fled England under the weight of his own schemes, leaving behind debts, broken trust, and a ruined name. The whispers that once followed Cassian like a curse faded into reluctant respect. Yet the greatest change did not belong to the Tun. It lived quietly inside the walls of Blackmir Hall. Cassian no longer walked beside Eve as a distant figure bound by duty. He walked beside her as a husband, learning how to share his world. Their days filled with small moments that carried more meaning than grand gestures. Morning tea taken together in the sunlit room, slow walks through the gardens where silence felt comfortable, not strained. Evenings spent reading by the fire, their shoulders close, their presence enough. Cassian spoke more now, not often, but honestly. He told her of his childhood shaped by strict expectations and solitude. Of how he learned early that power invited envy, and silence offered safety. Eve listened without judgment, understanding that his strength had been built from wounds rather than pride. Eve, in turn, found her voice growing stronger. She was no longer the frightened daughter carrying her family's shame. As Duchess of Thornwall, she took an active role in the estate, speaking with tenants, overseeing charities, and restoring neglected parts of the land. The people who once avoided her husband now watched with curiosity as the Duke stood back and let his wife lead, his trust clear in every quiet glance. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the lawn, Eve noticed Cassian watching her with an expression she had not seen before. It was unguarded, thoughtful, almost tender. "You belong here," he said simply. She turned to him, surprised. "I once thought this place was my prison." "And now?" "Now it feels like a home," she answered honestly. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Cassian spoke words he had carried in silence for too long. "I feared loving again," he said, his voice low. "I feared that if I reached for happiness, it would be taken from me as punishment." Eve reached for his hand. "Love is not a weakness," she said. "It is the bravest thing we do." Cassian looked at her then, truly looked at her, as though seeing her not as a duty, not as protection, but as his equal. When he kissed her, it was not hurried or demanding. It was slow and certain, filled with trust built over time. The touch that once left her speechless now felt familiar, steady, and safe. Months passed, and with them came laughter where there had once been silence. Blackmir Hall transformed not through renovations alone, but through warmth. The servants noticed it first. The Duke smiled more. The Duchess laughed freely. The halls echoed with life. One morning, a letter arrived from Eve's father. His health had improved, his debts long settled. He wrote of peace, of gratitude, of pride in the woman his daughter had become. Eve read the letter aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. Cassian listened quietly, then placed a gentle hand over hers. "You saved your family," he said. "We saved each other," she corrected. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Cassian presented her with a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate ring, a family heirloom passed down through generations. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said. "She believed love should be chosen every day, not assumed." Eve accepted it with tears in her eyes. This was not an obligation. This was acceptance. Later, as they stood together beneath the open sky, Eve rested her head against his chest. The man once called the Duke of Iron held her with quiet devotion. The fear that once surrounded him had melted away, replaced by something far stronger than reputation. Love. She thought of the girl who had stood trembling on her wedding night, expecting coldness and cruelty. She smiled at how wrong the world had been. She had married the most feared duke in England to save her family. But in his patience, his restraint, and his quiet strength, she found something far greater than safety. She found her heart. And as Cassian's arms held her close, his touch no longer a mystery but a promise, Eve knew one truth with certainty. What the world fears most often hides the deepest kindness.